if you don't know how to sell that skill, it will stop the business before it even starts.
I've shared, obviously, daily what we've been eating and had that on socials, and there are definitely people watching.
Yeah, I think backstory to it, obviously we've just completed 75 Hard, which has been a challenge in itself, and I thought, what better way to continue the good habits to jump into another program. So I reached out to a mentor. He basically had a coach who runs a program, and we just got started on it. But it started with that cleanse, obviously, and for anyone watching, the cleanse is rough. First 2 days I think were like celery, tomato, and tomato juice or something, and I absolutely detest tomato juice. That shit is awful.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting, to see how conditioned we are with the things that we typically eat with like convenience food.
Yeah, it's just been a bit of a challenge, I suppose. New challenge, new levels, new devils, and all that good jazz. So yeah, but we've got a pretty full docket this week for anyone watching. Hopefully this is a improvement on last week's episode. It was an interesting process, but trusting the journey and trusting that we can obviously deliver you guys some value for taking your time and you guys trusting us to spend an hour with us. This week is an exciting topic. So many stories that we can share, but this is all about the playbook, I suppose, in relation to growing that first $1 million, going from $0 and an idea and a dream to hitting that, was it $83,333 a month in recurring revenue in general. That kind of journey is very different to the next level, going from 2 to 3, and then the next level going from 3 to 5, which is kind of like where we kind of got stuck. This, for anyone who's watching it on video, is basically a graph showing our month-on-month revenue over time, growth, and obviously slight decline come the 5th of last year, or the 5th month of last year. So I suppose, Alex, you're the numbers person, being in accounting. Like, what's true for you in this graph, having lived it, I suppose?
Oh, that it's, this seamless, fluid.
Oh, yeah, always up.
Just going to the moon kind of relationship with, and as you grow, like, you just put less and less time into getting this graph to move forward. So,
yeah.
No, what does it say to me? Well, back in day one, when we were a totally different business, your first 12 months growing from basically nothing, as you've said, and as we've witnessed, to $1 million of annual recurring revenue, was just like absolute hustle mode, latching onto every opportunity, being every single Facebook group, DMing on LinkedIn, and trying to just drive pipeline from anywhere you can, capturing any and all revenue, and sometimes not even looking from like a margin perspective. You just wanting to close deals and start not, getting rings on the ladder. It's how it felt in the moment. We got to $1 million of annualized recurring revenue
in exactly a year. It looks like we crossed that line in exactly a year, so that's quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely steady progress. And then I think from, that next kind of 500K or 750K, we continue to close deals and the pipeline was still moving, but that's where I feel like energetically we took our foot off the pedal a little bit, because then focus became more on delivery and operations and streamlining, and, there wasn't as much of an aggressive kind of growth over the next 6, 7, 8 months. Every business needs to do that and consolidate somewhat, because, if you're just selling and operations can't keep up from a delivery perspective, you're going to tank, as, we kind of get to later on in the piece. But
this journey here was really interesting in the sense that, like you said, it was just driving pipeline from wherever we possibly could, right? Like, and previous network, we were literally selling anything to anyone. And to anyone listening, what would you say would be the biggest skill you've got to learn in this first $1 million?
That's a great question. I think one thing that instantly comes to mind is the skill of being disciplined and being really consistent with actions day in, day out. One thing that I massively struggle with, even now, almost 5 years on, is like the follow-up side of business. And can remember pretty clearly that first 12 months, we're just on the ball with any little sniff, making sure that follow-ups are done, everything's booked in the calendar. meticulously monitored. I think, being on top of where prospects are and where they're at in the buying cycle, being familiar with that and really driving intentional actions to it gets you that initial momentum that you can then rely upon. You've built yourself a base of revenue. You're starting to take a bit of a surplus, which is awesome. Takes a bit of the pressure off. Double-edged sword being that if you take your foot off the gas without hitting that stability kind of, so obviously you can grow initial momentum, and you can almost kid yourself that like, oh, we're just flying now, just flying. It's kind of done. Mission's complete. We got to $1 million.
Oh my gosh, it's coming in no matter what we do. Oh yeah, we're sorted for life.
Yeah,
I remember that feeling.
Yeah. We've got 8 clients now, and then reflecting, you're like, yeah, one of those clients have got like 7 staff with us, and if they leave, we're back down to 300K a year. So
I think it's also important to remember, this is all relative to what type of business people are in, right? So for us, when we were doing this, we were selling a service, being outsourcing, that is a very predictable revenue, month-on-month revenue. It can be a little bit less predictable if they're not selling something that's monthly recurring. But for me, I think the master skill in those first $1 million is learning to sell. That's got to be, you touched on it just before, like if you don't know how to sell, that skill, it will stop the business before it even starts, I suppose.
99% of businesses as well in that first 12 months, it is all founder-led initiation activity. Yeah, and if you don't not so much master the art, but you put the reps in and you understand the sales process and the psyche that sits behind it, which we've been pretty blessed to be able to expose ourselves to a lot of that in the last few years. Just getting things off the ground can be pretty tough, be brutal, really. That
first kind of is that sales. And I think a big thing I found myself falling into, and I don't know if this is part of your story as well, is like wanting to get myself out of sales as quickly as possible. For people going from that 0 to $1 million stage, it's the wrong move. That's been my experience anyway. It's just, I wanted to because it's not been something that's really enjoyed, but in the whole like replacement ladder that Dan Martell teaches, sales and marketing is the last thing on the list. The first thing is that kind of operational piece. But for you, what would be like the kind of feeling during this journey, I suppose, is another great question.
Oh, I think it's quite an exciting space, especially when you're in business with somebody else. I've not got the experience, I guess, of going on that hustle and that grind just solo. But, waking up and knowing that, we got sales calls today, what can we close today? Who are we following up with? Like, this one deal, where is it going to take us from and to, is quite an exciting kind of vibe. For me, sales in this context was pretty fresh, so there was a lot to learn, which I do enjoy learning stuff. So this was, it was quite a nice challenge, exciting challenge. It was pre-children, which also gives you way more brain space and energy to pour into it. And then I think after maybe 12, 18 months, it was that. I remember us having them conversations around, right, are we going to run a founder-led sales operation for the rest of time, or are we going to try to build this function so that we are closing deals without us, etc. And that whole journey in itself is reflected into 2023 up until a couple of months ago in 2024. That was the whole journey that we've been on by way of sales channels and things like that. But we can speak a bit more to that. I
think I really want to double click on this area because it's an area where it's definitely the area that people either never start or never finish, is that 0 to $1 million stage, right? And a prominent story that I remember in our journey was actually sitting down with Grant at the bar. And I remember asking the question, hey, have you always been ready to sell the service or build the business? Or, have you always had everything laid out before you've actually gone after a contract or tried to sell a client, or, have you had it all laid out? And he was like, absolutely not. And he told us the story of, do you remember the story?
Yeah, I remember what's going on.
Yeah. He told us the story of him getting his first contract to run a call center for a very large multinational. For anyone listening, this guy sold his first business for about $80 million in New Zealand, which is, by no means a small feat. And he said, Josh, no, I've never been ready for any business that I have started. And the story was that he went after a contract for a call center for a large multinational energy company, and he got it. He was cheapest by far, somehow managed to lock in the contract, and he had a week to set up a full outsourced call center. In that week, he bought 25 computers, found a place to put everyone, hired everyone, like literally on his own, and then was taking calls for the first 2 weeks just to try and get all the systems up and running. And it's a prominent story for me in the sense that you don't always have to be ready. You know, you can just kind of take that first step and go after it. And it's by doing that that you're going to get the learnings. I think a lot of people sit on the side of the court and don't go after what they want, or don't go after that contract or pitch that client or whatever, because they don't have everything operationally running. Operations, I feel like, in getting smooth operations is an important step at the kind of next level of revenue from that kind of 2 to 3 mark, would you say? I think that's where we, or my version of the story, is have accumulated a lot of operational debt that we had in systems, processes, all that kind of stuff. And we can talk about that more, because that is definitely, I think, what's caused that decline later on. But yeah, I don't know if you remember that story and what your kind of takeaways from it were.
Yeah, I remember that. That was here in Taupo, hey, when Grant was on site. And obviously we'll plug this to him so he gets just a bit of a stroke on his ego.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the other thing that came out of that for me was that you'll just never be ready. You'll never be ready to fully step into an opportunity. You know, when something does present itself, you just gotta jump in. You just gotta say yes, and then you figure out the rest of the shit that brings it into life. I think there's this misconception that does exist within business that things do need to be perfect all the time. The reality is, you name one instance of the last 5 years that has been a perfect concoction of things hitting the ground running. It's not true. However, that being said, when you do dive into something that you've not got all the stars aligned, and you end up reflecting a month, 2 months, 3 months down the line, it almost portrays itself as being perfect. It just perfectly unfolds. So similar to you, my biggest takeaway was like, throw yourself at opportunities and say yes and figure out the shit later on.
100%. And in that first part where typically, you know, the business had no brand, it had no reputation, it had no Facebook presence, like those are the times where you can iterate. And I suppose I also believe that it's where the business, or the time in business where you've got the most agility. You've got no staff, very few staff. You can make decisions on the fly, and you can adjust and get things done quite quickly. Where as you start building the boat and the ship, it starts to take a little bit longer to adjust course if something was to go wrong, or, you know, the service offering wasn't actually 100%, well, it wasn't profitable or whatever. That kind of stuff is later on in the piece. So yeah, anyone listening that's in that stage, I just say, like, just go for it and figure the stuff out later. Which brings me to that next point. I think the biggest prominent moment in that early stage was getting our first 6-figure contract. That was a bit of a process. I'll tell everyone a bit of a backstory to this. We were in between business models, where we were kind of deciding whether we were going to go down a managed service offshoring outsourcing route versus a remote staffing. And the difference being, managed services, we manage the outcomes of the staff, where remote staffing was just, let's hire, recruit, and help manage performance rather than outcomes. And we were in between that stage, but someone that we knew from our network marketing journey kind of popped up in a leadership position in a startup in Dubai, and he gave us an opportunity. Essentially, like, they needed to outsource their finance function. They had a pretty complex set of requirements, all that kind of stuff. I remember sitting there going, Alex, this is like our time to really value base price our service offering and set ourselves up for the next stage of growth. Do you remember the feeling of when that contract was actually signed?
From a perspective of complete disbelief.
Yeah, complete disbelief. Your name, we're here.
Yeah,
Jerry's ice cream. We came around, just pigged out.
Yeah, but I think what was important though with that is that obviously we got in at a really low level, and we're doing some basic kind of bookkeeping just to show that, hey, we can actually deliver something. And then when that opportunity came up to replace internals and do a done for you thing. I just remember like the back and forth we had over pricing, like the limiting beliefs, like are we actually worthy of charging, 6 figures a year for delivering this as a service?
And the justifications we went through. Oh man, how many people are they going to have to hire internally? All this kind of stuff. And it's such an important distinction to make, because one thing I've found through, dealing with multiple vendors that I believe would be underneath $1 million a year in revenue is there's this paradox that goes on, right? Which is, hey, I'm new to business, but I know what I'm doing. And that's one side of it. And then the other side of it is I'm new to business, but I'm absolutely 100% committed to getting the outcome that you need. So I see when we partner with companies that are doing, probably less than $2 million a year, that founder's typically very involved in operations. And sometimes you just get a far better service from them because you're not just a number in a pool of their 1,000 clients. You are actually they really care about the revenue and they really care about you as a client. And I think where I'm kind of going with this is that is also important to understand that dichotomy, that there's sometimes two sides of your brain going on, which is one, I'm new to this business, I can't charge too much, but two, I know I'm going to be able to get these results for the client. And where do you how do you price in that kind of like yin and yang mode? And I remember vividly driving home from a party about 2 hours away, and I was a no reception road, as there are lots of them in New Zealand, and you were about to send the contract, and it was for less. It was a 5-figure sum, not a 6-figure sum, I think it was. Or no, it was, that's what I mean, 5 figures a month, not 6 figures a month, like per month. And
no, we weren't going to charge 6 figures per month. 4 figures versus
4 figures, 5. Yeah, we got there, 4 figures for this.
An 8K instead of a 10K.
That's exactly what I mean. That's what I mean. And I remember coming to a corner where I just knew there was no reception, and I sent the message, hey, change it by I think it was like 3,000 a month or something.
Yeah.
And it didn't send. And for whatever reason, you were out, not, hadn't seen the contract, and I don't know what was going on your side, but I keep seeing the Slack notification, this hasn't sent. And I was like, come on, please have not sent it. And then it finally sent, and we actually closed it at a higher figure because we valued the actual, what we were going to be able to deliver. And for whatever reason, I kind of got myself in the place of, if we lose, we lose, we win, we win. What was your kind of experience on that? Because I think so many people can learn that from that, not to, yes, be humble in the sense that you're new to business, but also don't devalue the offering.
This was obviously very early on, probably within the first 6 months, maybe?
First 6 months, yeah.
And I guess the struggle that I had was because I heard so much about us just capturing revenue.
Yeah.
It was like, if I present something a little bit less, then there's more chance of this closing, versus, actually carrying, confidence in what you can deliver and the subsequent value and what that kind of dollar expectation to yourself is. And that was a present thing, not just with this contract, maybe throughout the first 12 months. I was always the person leaning towards it being less than more, in the hopes that it increased chances of things closing. That was purely, I suppose, just a massive belief system, not that I had to work through on my side. Vividly remember that exchange. And then, when you say about it closing, obviously, you were away. Family were here, and I'm sure we did a bit of a celebration dance, most of them. Yeah,
Ben and Jerry's. I remember going to the petrol station, picking it up, paying $22 for a tiny bit of ice cream, and coming around and sharing it between 7 people. So
what better way to celebrate contracts closing than really good calories? Yeah, that was a big moment, wasn't it?
Massive moment. An important point there, though, the pricing side of it, because we've always had discussions of pricing, and now that we kind of went down that remote staffing route, we've realized how commoditized the market is. It is, every company is trying to attract the same talent. We're all trying to deliver the same, basically the same service offering, but companies don't grow without margin, right? And this is something that you've been taking the complete opposite turn now and been like, Josh, we need more margin, because we were now moving from that $1 million a year mark to the $2 million a year mark in a very, very short amount of time relative to what it took us to kind of get to that $1 million. No, sorry, it wasn't a short amount of time. It was just quite rapid for our experience, I suppose. And that margin gave us a buffer to be able to make the mistakes that we clearly did. We clearly made some mistakes. So what's your position on pricing? There's so many methodologies. There's value-based pricing if you're in a commoditized market, which is quite a good concept for like accounting service offerings. And I suppose your social media management marketing is becoming quite a commoditized market as well. And, there's all these kind of things, but margin is crucial. It's something that you look at regularly. It's something that most businesses don't. But what was your kind of thinking around that next level as we were kind of starting to scale and hire more people internally because we couldn't manage the workload?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, what you get consumed with very early on is revenue, like the top line, grow the top line. And then you start to actually sit back and understand your business model. And like for us and our specific model, revenue is just an ego metric. Like just the way that our business operates, the gross margin is like the key fundamental driver of success for us as a business. Because we're in a volume-based business, because each seat contributes margin to, our P&L and where we sit. The onus then became, how do we deliver consistent margins? Because we went through a stage of very inconsistent margins per contract because we didn't have a solid sales and pricing framework in place, So yeah, from a perspective of like pricing, I think that if you take on board that revenue doesn't really mean that much because it's what's left at the end of the day that's going to keep the lights on. Sales isn't typically going to just do that on its own, although it obviously helps. But your margins, if you've got healthy margins, it gives you room to grow. It gives you surplus to pour into, the theme of today, which is spend. It enables you to take risks if your margins are healthy. It protects you against downturns in business that, we've experienced that in the last 12 months. So if you can keep consistent margins across your product base, it's almost just arming yourself with the right weapons for the war, basically.
Totally. We've seen a lot of businesses with not so healthy margins and the struggle that creates, right? And when we were doing a lot of the managed service accounting stuff, I remember vividly a client, and it was kind of like they were cursed in the sense that no matter what they sold, it was not profitable. Like it would be like, yeah, we sold a $10,000 contract. And it's like, yeah, but I've got to hire 3 contractors and a outsourced VA to just deliver on it. Is an important distinction to make, because as soon as we started adding costs to the business, being our operations manager, our HR manager, our client success manager, we added Salesforce very early on in the journey. We added, we made mistakes that cost us money. Without that margin, we would be toast like this. Like we would be eating toast. That's all we'd be eating. Like the kids would be eating toast.
Brings back PTSD of buying value beans and pack and save. So, let's not go back there. But at the end of the day, like your margins aren't where they need to be, then the one thing that suffers is cash flow.
And it's a lesson that we've learned. I saw a post by Jason Andrews, and I remember you sending it to me actually, and it said, there are 2 types of businesses that have experienced cash flow troubles, and there's businesses that are going to. And that is such a macro look at not just the fact that, some businesses are not profitable, but also the macroeconomy changes. We have interest rate hikes or whatever, and that completely changes consumer behavior, which is important to look at. As you deal with more clients, you will have a bigger percentage of, or a bigger reference point, or whatever you'd call it, like a bigger pool of people with different businesses that go through different stages that will affect yours long term. And it is important to recognize as you grow, you get a bigger percentage of that, and that can massively affect you. A big journey for us in that next level of growth was obviously trying to build out pricing models, right? And I think you'd agree that it's a struggle. It's not an easy task. And, we're actually quite numbers driven in the sense of our minds work that way. What's your position on building out those models? I think, for me, it's always got to understand your own business model to be able to build out your kind of how you're going to price things. There's value-based pricing. There's, I know we went through the process of like getting proposals from other companies and seeing where we sit in the middle of things. Like, where do we want to position ourselves? There's that side of it. There's just, do you just provide a way better service so you can charge more? Like, there's so many different things to kind of think about. What's your kind of position on it, and how have you thought about it? Because I know you scream margin, I scream I'm just going to keep selling. And, recently we look at this blip. Let's just be fair to old Josh, because your joke for the entire of our journey is, oh, yeah, that's Josh's pricing, which means, in Alex's words, no margin. But we see a jump here. Josh has been doing something, and we've sold some pretty well-priced contracts recently. So credit where credit's due. Pat on the back to myself. Thank you very much, Josh. Even our operations manager, who screams this as well when we give him hiring budgets, has been like, oh, that's actually quite a healthy budget there, Josh. So maybe you could talk a bit more about that, and a context of like what could help people who are maybe in that, somewhere in this journey, and maybe don't know exactly what it costs to deliver a service or a product or whatever.
Yeah, I guess firstly, just a bit of acknowledgement, Josh. It's almost took you 5 years to learn how to price margin. So maybe the next 5 years won't be as troublesome.
Hopefully.
Yeah, no, I think from a pricing perspective, for me, having a very logical brain, it comes down to just a few facets, and, it has to be built off your cost base, and you've got to really understand the costs, fixed and variable, within your business. And for us specifically, it's that variable component, i.e. salary expectations for staff. That does add some complexity to the business model. We can look back on 3 years of OPEX data to understand what, typically we're going to experience from a rent, a subscriptions, insurances, general kind of expenses, that sort of stuff. It's more that variable cost of labor for us in our business model, where a lot of time and attention's had to kind of been delivered into to give us like a complete cost base to then be able to make decisions around, well, are we going to go value-based? If we are, what does margin look like? Are we going to go like a fixed margin per seat, which is currently what we operate under typically? And again, that's because it protects us against that variability. Unless we get it completely wrong, and salary expectations are way higher than what we've kind of judged before we sign contracts. What would you say?
What would you say for other businesses in the sense, though? Because like obviously we run a service-based business, but there are other small businesses in the space that would be selling product, and I think like that's sometimes a little bit easier to manage when you've got suppliers who have the same fixed cost, all that kind of stuff. I think it's important to separate service and like the principle is the same, but sometimes it's easier or more difficult to get that cost base, where I feel like we're in a very dynamic floating marketplace where you've got salary expectations and all that kind of stuff, where, I don't know, someone who's selling a hair product, for example, may only have an adjustment in cost every 6 months to 12 months. And for those people, I'm very envious of you.
I'd be asking, why do you not know your cost base? But
exactly.
Can you please show me the catalogue? There's definitely a difference. And again, it comes down to, once you do have that distinguished cost base, you've ultimately just got to throw out the scenarios of, well, if we charge 20% margin, what does the surplus like versus 40% versus 60%? Oh, will the market pay 70% margin on that? And that's where like your industry nuance and knowledge comes into play. And if you don't have that, and you opt for them really, really strong margins, and that's where you do have to deliver, say in a product-based business, it's all about, well, obviously the product's got to be shit hot to begin with, but then it's about the customer experience to capture the business, then to take them through to before they receive the product, what's the journey like, post receiving the product, what's like your kind of customer experience and care experience look like after that to justify the margins and ultimately the sell price that you've got in place. But I still think that that fundamental of understanding your costs, whether you just throw it all down, I don't know, piece of paper and you rip it out that way. If you're a bit of an Excel nerd like us, then you throw everything in a spreadsheet and build it out that way. But you just need to get absolutely clear on all costs involved with delivering your product or service. Yeah,
I think it's the 90-10 rule in this sense as well. Like you can probably get 90% of the information you need to make a decision based on your costs from the back of the envelope, and then you can get that last 10%. Is where you need to kind of throw it in a spreadsheet. But we've done some numbers on back of envelopes many a time and, you know, been pretty accurate. Sometimes we're a little bit off, but it's just the practice of getting them, I suppose, to understand and actually thinking about it for sure.